In 2009, on a family farm in Chouteau County, Montana, a machine weighing 100,000 pounds sat silent inside a steel shed. It measured 27 feet long and 21 feet wide. Its 16-cylinder Detroit diesel engine was in perfect working order. Its massive custom transmission, built to handle 900 horsepower, could still shift flawlessly. The tractor was not broken. The farm had not failed. The field still needed turning, but the machine could not move. The United Farm Tire Company, the last manufacturer of the specific 8-foot rubber tires required to carry this immense weight, had gone bankrupt years earlier. The original tires on the tractor were rotting, and the global agricultural supply chain no longer manufactured replacements. 3 decades earlier, this exact machine had dominated the soil of the San Joaquin Valley in California. It had ripped deep through hardpan clay, pulling an 80-foot cultivator, finishing 3 acres of cotton ground every 60 seconds. It was designed in America by an independent shop to be invincible. It was built to outlast any mass-produced tractor from John Deere, Case, or International Harvester. And it did. The iron survived. The engine survived. But absolute mechanical supremacy meant nothing without a set of tires. The largest farm tractor ever constructed on Earth was paralyzed not by a mechanical failure, but by a corporate bankruptcy and a discontinued mold. But the real story of the Big Bud 747 in America is not just the story of a massive machine stranded in a Montana shed. It is the story of a war between 2 different visions of American farming. It is the story of raw, independent custom engineering colliding with the absolute unforgiving limits of corporate agricultural supply chains. Every week, we tell the stories of the machines built to conquer American fields with absolute engineering, and what the ruthless market did to them. Like the video, and subscribe if that history matters to you. The story of the Big Bud 747 begins not in a corporate manufacturing plant in Illinois, but in a small custom fabrication shop in Havre, Montana, in the late 1960s. To understand why the Big Bud 747 was forged, one must first understand what the American agricultural landscape lacked in the decade before its creation. By the early 1970s, the United States was undergoing a massive agricultural transformation. The federal government, under Secretary of Agriculture Earl Boots, was urging farmers to plant fence row to fence row. The mandate was clear: expand your acreage, maximize your yield, and feed the global market. Across the Great Plains and the sprawling valleys of the West, family farms were consolidating into massive commercial operations. As the fields grew larger, the window of time to plant and harvest them remained exactly the same. To beat the weather, American farmers needed to cover more ground in less time, with fewer men. The major domestic manufacturers, John Deere in Waterloo, International Harvester in Chicago, and J.I. Case in Racine, responded by building larger machines. They introduced the modern articulated tractor, a heavy-duty machine with a hinge in the middle of its chassis, allowing a massive vehicle to steer by bending rather than turning its front wheels. These corporate giants produced excellent, reliable equipment, but they manufactured for the statistical average. Their assembly lines were designed to produce tractors that fit the needs of a typical Midwestern corn or soybean operation. By the mid-1970s, the largest commercially available articulated tractors from these corporate brands were producing somewhere between 200 and 300 horsepower. For the vast majority of the country, that was enough. But in the extreme frontiers of American farming, 300 horsepower was not a solution. It was a severe bottleneck. In the rolling, endless wheat fields of Montana, and particularly in the irrigated cotton fields of California, the earth demanded more. In the San Joaquin Valley, decades of heavy irrigation and constant heavy machinery traffic had created a condition known as hardpan, a dense, concrete-like layer of compacted soil sitting just beneath the surface. Hardpan restricts root growth. It stops water drainage, It suffocates crop yields. The only way to destroy it is a process called deep ripping, dragging massive, heavy steel shanks 3 feet deep into the solid earth to shatter the compacted clay. It was a brutally violent mechanical process. When farmers hitched wide, deep-ripping implements to standard, mass-produced articulated tractors, the earth fought back. The strain was so immense that standard commercial tractors would literally tear themselves apart. Transmissions overheated and shattered. Axles snapped under the torque. Steel frames twisted and fractured. An American cotton farmer trying to deep rip 1,000 acres with standard equipment was practically guaranteeing a catastrophic mechanical failure. What these extreme operations lacked was not a tractor. They lacked unbreakable, limitless, industrial-grade force. The answer to this absence did not come from a corporate boardroom in the Midwest. It came from a windswept railroad town on the high plains, Havre, Montana. Here, far from the corporate supply chains of Illinois and Iowa, the Northern Manufacturing Company was building custom agricultural equipment under the Big Bud brand. Led by a visionary named Ron Harmon, the shop in Havre operated on a completely different philosophy than the corporate giants. They did not build machines to meet a retail price point. They built custom, heavy-duty tractors for local Montana wheat farmers who operated on a massive scale and lived hundreds of miles from the nearest dealership. Harmon's philosophy was simple: over-engineer the steel, use standardized heavy industry components that could be sourced anywhere, and design the machine so a farmer could fix it in the dirt with a standard wrench. In 1977, this philosophy collided with the desperate needs of the California cotton industry. Julius and Carl Rossi, brothers who operated a massive cotton farming empire in Bakersfield, California, were exhausted by the limitations of commercial machinery. Their San Joaquin Valley fields were plagued by severe hardpan. They needed to deep rip thousands of acres quickly, and they were tired of destroying conventional tractors in the process. The Rossi brothers bypassed the local John Deere and Case dealerships entirely. They traveled to the remote northern manufacturing facility in Montana and presented Ron Harmon with a simple, unprecedented challenge. Build a single custom tractor so heavy and so powerful that the California earth could not break it. The cost of this commission was staggering. The Rossi brothers agreed to pay approximately $300,000 in 1977 for the custom build, roughly $1.5 million today. In a domestic market where a brand new, top-of-the-line corporate tractor cost a fraction of that amount, this figure was not merely a purchase price. It was a massive industrial investment. The Rossi brothers were essentially funding the research, development, and construction of a one-of-a-kind, earth-moving titan. The Havre factory accepted the contract. They possessed no automated assembly lines. They had no corporate research and development division, but they had master welders, an intimate understanding of raw torque, and a willingness to source components from the commercial mining and logging industries rather than traditional agricultural suppliers. For the next several months, the small crew in Montana began cutting and welding steel plates, measuring several inches thick. They were not simply building a new model of Big Bud, they were constructing a monument to mechanical horsepower. The machine they were preparing to send down to the San Joaquin Valley would alter the scale of what American farmers believed was physically possible. When the doors of the Northern Manufacturing Company facility in Havre finally opened in late 1977, the machine that rolled onto the Montana tarmac defied every conventional metric of agricultural engineering. It was officially designated the Big Bud 165 747. To the men who built it and the farmers who had commissioned it, it was simply the 747. The physical dimensions of the tractor were staggering. It measured 27 feet in length, 20 feet in width, and 14 feet in height. It was wider than a rural highway lane. It was taller than a single-story farmhouse. It was heavier than a fully loaded commercial freight truck. Fully ballasted and carrying a full load of diesel, The Big Bud 747 weighed approximately 100,000 pounds. In an era where a top-tier John Deere or International Harvester articulated tractor weighed roughly 25,000 pounds, the Big Bud was not merely a step forward in scale. It was a completely different class of industrial machinery. Beneath the massive steel hood sat the heart of the Titan, a 16-cylinder Detroit diesel 16V 92T engine. This was a twin-turbocharged two-stroke power plant designed specifically for massive mining excavators and commercial maritime vessels, not for turning farm dirt. In its original configuration, the engine produced a staggering 760 horsepower, a number that would later be upgraded to over 900 horsepower. But in the heavy clay of California, raw engine horsepower is useless if the machine cannot grip the earth. The Northern manufacturing team understood the physics of drawbar pull, the actual usable physical force a tractor can transfer through its rear hitch to drag an implement through resistant soil. To convert that immense horsepower into traction, the Big Bud 747 was fitted with 8 custom-built, 8-foot-tall tires manufactured by the United Farm Tire Company. The sheer weight of the 100,000-pound frame pressed those dual wheels into the earth, ensuring that when the Detroit diesel engine roared, the tires did not spin. They gripped. They pulled. They moved the earth. The financial cost of this mechanical supremacy was breathtaking. At its delivery in 1977, the Big Bud 747 carried a price tag of $300,000. Roughly $1.5 million today. To understand the gravity of that number, one must look at the American dealership lots of the same year. A flagship Steiger Panther or a top-of-the-line Case articulated tractor cost approximately $60,000. For the price of one Big Bud, a farmer could have purchased an entire fleet of 5 conventional high-horsepower machines. Yet for the Rossi brothers and the extreme demands of their operation, the Big Bud offered something that a fleet of 5 tractors could not: an unbreakable American moat. The true breakthrough of the 747 and of the entire Big Bud philosophy was not just its size, it was its architecture. The corporate giants of the Midwest engineered their tractors with proprietary cast-iron components. If a transmission failed on a Case or a John Deere, the farmer was captive to the dealership. They had to wait for proprietary parts, pay dealership labor rates, and suffer through agonizing downtime. Ron Harmon and the engineers in Havre rejected that model entirely. They built the Big Bud using standardized, off-the-shelf heavy industrial components. The transmission was a massive twin-disc power shift unit, typically found in heavy earth-moving equipment. The axles were Clark planetary units, built for commercial logging and mining. The engine was a standard Detroit diesel. This open architecture design meant that a farmer did not need a specialized, brand-certified dealership technician to fix the machine. Any competent diesel mechanic, armed with standard heavy-duty tools and access to a commercial mining or trucking parts supplier, could rebuild a Big Bud in a dirt field. For a massive farm operation where weather windows dictated financial survival, the ability to repair a tractor independently was the ultimate competitive advantage. When the Big Bud 747 was transported from the high plains of Montana to the sun-baked soil of Bakersfield, California, its distribution and operational breakthrough was immediate. It did not require a massive marketing campaign. It required a field test. The Rossi brothers hitched the massive tractor to a custom-built 80-foot-wide cultivator and a massive deep-ripping plow designed to tear through the San Joaquin Valley hardpan. The results shocked the local agricultural community. The machine pulled the heavy shanks 3 feet deep into the concrete like clay without stalling, without twisting its frame, and without overheating. The 1,000-gallon fuel tank allowed the operator to run the machine continuously for multiple days without stopping to refuel. Word of the 747's raw physical dominance spread rapidly across the American agricultural infrastructure. It drew the immediate attention of the deep-ripping contractors of the Central Valley, who saw a way to monetize such massive horsepower. The San Joaquin Valley Agricultural Extension agents and local soil conservation boards monitored the machine, noting how effectively it shattered hardpan and improved water drainage for subsequent cotton crops. Heavy implement dealers in California realized they now had to build wider, heavier plows just to keep up with the tractor's capabilities. Back on the Great Plains, the Montana wheat cooperatives that had watched the tractor's assembly recognized that Northern manufacturing had successfully built the ultimate weapon for massive-scale farming. Within months, national agricultural trade publications like Farm Journal and Implement and Tractor dispatched reporters to document the machine, cementing its status not just as a custom curiosity, but as a legitimate engineering marvel. The name welded onto the thick steel chassis was not just a brand. It was a guarantee of absolute, unapologetic industrial force. The Big Bud 747 had proved that when the limits of corporate manufacturing failed, independent American engineering could still forge a titan. When the Big Bud 747 was dropped into the soil of Bakersfield, California, in the late 1970s, it did not merely operate. It conquered. The Rossi brothers hitched the colossal machine to an 80-foot wide cultivator, an implement so massive it required its own specialized hydraulic folding mechanisms just to be legally transported down a county road. To watch the 747 work was to witness a fundamental shift in agricultural physics. The 16-cylinder Detroit diesel engine roared with a deafening, industrial cadence, sending power through the massive transmission and down to the 8 custom rubber tires. Moving at speeds of up to 8 miles per hour, the tractor could turn and cultivate 3 acres of cotton ground every 60 seconds. It dragged heavy steel shanks through the infamous California hardpan without a single hesitation, shattering the compacted earth that had previously destroyed standard commercial tractors. In the San Joaquin Valley, where a sudden shift in weather or a tight irrigation schedule could cost a massive commercial farm millions of dollars in lost yield, the Big Bud 747's raw pulling power could mean the difference between preparing 1,000 acres in a weekend or losing the planting window entirely. The machine became an immediate cultural phenomenon within the American agricultural community. It was not just a piece of farm equipment, it was a pilgrimage site. Local farmers, heavy machinery mechanics, and even rival dealership owners would pull their trucks to the side of the California highways just to watch the white colossus turn the earth. The California Farm Bureau noted the unprecedented efficiency. Implement and Tractor magazine documented the raw numbers. The local San Joaquin equipment dealers suddenly found themselves scrambling to manufacture wider, heavier, and deeper plows because the 747 was physically capable of breaking the implements it was meant to pull. While the 747 remained a custom, one-of-a-kind titan, its success acted as the ultimate halo product for the Northern Manufacturing Company. The message broadcast from the California cotton fields to the rest of the country was unmistakable. If the mechanics in Have, Montana, could build a 100,000-pound machine that could not be broken by the earth, their production models could survive anything. Almost overnight, the Big Bud brand transitioned from a regional Montana secret to a national symbol of extreme agricultural horsepower. Orders began pouring into the small factory in Havre from across the American continent. Wheat cooperatives in Chouteau County, Montana, purchased the 525 horsepower models to pull massive air seeders across endless prairie horizons. Corporate farming operations in the Texas Panhandle bought them to break dry, baked earth. Sugarcane plantations in Florida ordered Big Buds to drag heavy carts through thick, muddy peat bogs, where standard dual-wheel tractors would sink to their axles. The dealer network expanded rapidly from the Pacific Northwest down through the Great Plains. Independent farm equipment dealers in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas Distributors who were exhausted by the strict corporate quotas imposed by the major manufacturing brands eagerly signed contracts to carry the white tractors. They knew that selling a Big Bud meant selling a machine that a farmer could fix without a proprietary computer or a specialized dealership technician. The engine was standard. The transmission was standard. The axles were standard. The value proposition was not just power, it was mechanical sovereignty. By the turn of the 1980s, the Northern Manufacturing Company was no longer just a custom fabrication shop. It had evolved into a legitimate specialized industrial force. They introduced the Series 3 tractors, featuring an innovative tilt cabin design that allowed mechanics to access the entire drivetrain in minutes, and horsepower ratings that consistently dwarfed the flagship models of John Deere, Case, and Steiger. At the peak of their production scale, Big Bud was manufacturing approximately 10 to 12 massive articulated tractors every month. While that number seems minuscule compared to the automated assembly lines in Illinois, which pumped out hundreds of utility tractors a week, in the ultra-high horsepower market, it represented a dominant market share. Every Big Bud that rolled out of Havre carried a premium price tag, often approaching or exceeding $100,000. They were bought by a highly specific, highly capitalized class of American farmers who required absolute mechanical supremacy. By 1979, the demand for this uncompromising mechanical sovereignty had completely overwhelmed the original Havre shop. To keep pace with the influx of orders from the Dakotas, the Pacific Northwest, and the massive corporate farms of the South, the Northern Manufacturing Company broke ground on a sprawling, state-of-the-art production facility in Montana. At its peak, this factory floor operated as a temple of heavy industry. Thick steel plates were cut and welded into virtually indestructible chassis. Massive Clark planetary axles, originally engineered for the commercial logging industry, were stacked in orderly rows. Hundreds of high-horsepower Detroit diesel and Cummins engines waited to be dropped into the stark white frames. The cultural resonance of the Big Bud brand reached its absolute zenith during the early 1980s. To fully grasp this moment, one must look at the American field demonstrations and regional farm shows of the era. When a corporate manufacturer like John Deere or Steiger demonstrated a new articulated model, they brought 30-foot implements to pull behind it. When a Big Bud dealer arrived at a farm show in North Dakota or Washington State, they brought custom-built 60-foot chisel plows. The white machines did not just participate in these demonstrations, they dominated them. They pulled faster. They ripped deeper. They idled with a ferocity that the mass-produced, highly regulated corporate tractors could not match. For the elite tier of American agriculture, the white paint became the ultimate status symbol. It signaled that a farm operated on a scale that transcended conventional machinery. On a massive 10,000-acre dry-land wheat operation in the High Plains, where a delayed spring planting could slash harvest yields by half, a Big Bud 525/50 running continuously for 48 hours did not just save time. It secured the financial survival of the entire farm. The immense drawbar pull allowed a single operator to accomplish the work of 3 men, eliminating staggering labor costs and collapsing a week of field preparation into a single, uninterrupted weekend. At the center of this golden era, the original Big Bud 747 remained the undisputed king of the dirt. Its legend only grew as it moved across the country. After conquering the hardpan of the San Joaquin Valley, the Rossi brothers eventually sold the 100,000-pound behemoth to Willowbrook Farms in Indialantic, Florida. There, the machine was tasked with deep plowing thick, heavy, swampy acreage to prepare the ground for agriculture. It continued to operate flawlessly, proving that its custom engineering was not merely a regional trick for dry clay, but a universal solution to extreme agricultural demands. The 747 was the mythical flagship, but the hundreds of Series 3 tractors working fields from California to Canada were the conquering army. By 1981, the Big Bud dealer network stretched across the North American continent. Over 500 custom-built high-horsepower tractors had rolled out of the Avra factory. They were globally legendary for their sheer weight, their open architecture repairability, and their unapologetic brute force. Step onto an independent dealership lot in Montana or Kansas during this peak, and the sight was magnificent. A row of massive 14-foot-tall white tractors gleaming under the prairie sun, promising an American farmer that he would never again be held hostage by a broken proprietary transmission or a corporate service backlog. The Northern Manufacturing Company had successfully achieved what the agricultural industry believed was impossible. An independent, regional shop in a remote railroad town had out-engineered the largest agricultural conglomerates on Earth, capturing the highest and most lucrative tier of the horsepower market. They had built a mechanical empire that could not be broken by the earth, by the weather, or by the implements they dragged. But the empire was built entirely on the assumption that the American farm economy would continue to expand forever. By 1980, the trajectory of the American agricultural market shifted violently. The expansionist mandate of the 1970s, the federal push to plant fence row to fence row, which had justified the creation of massive machines, collided with a macroeconomic reality that no tractor manufacturer could out-engineer. The golden age of limitless mechanical horsepower was over. The long decline of the independent tractor empire had begun. The first structural force to strike the Northern Manufacturing Company was a devastating combination of farm credit, regulation, and political headwinds. In 1980, the federal government imposed an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union. For the dryland wheat farmers of Montana, the Dakotas, and the Pacific Northwest, the exact demographic that formed the core customer base for Big Bud, the embargo was an economic earthquake. Commodity prices plummeted instantly. Wheat became virtually worthless compared to the immense cost of growing it. Simultaneously, to combat rampant national inflation, the United States Federal Reserve raised interest rates to unprecedented heights. The prime rate, the baseline interest rate that commercial banks charge their most credit-worthy corporate customers, peaked at over 20%. Throughout the 1970s, farmers had financed their massive expansion by borrowing against the rapidly inflating value of their land. When commodity prices crashed, land values collapsed with them. The equity vanished. The farm debt crisis consumed the agricultural heartland. In a market where a custom Big Bud Series 3 tractor cost well over $100,000, a 20% equipment loan transformed a necessary industrial investment into a financial death sentence. An American wheat farmer facing immediate bank foreclosure does not buy a new 100,000-pound custom tractor. He patches his old equipment, he scales back his acreage, he cancels his contracts. The orders at the Havre factory did not simply slow down, they evaporated almost overnight. Independent dealers in the Dakotas, the Pacific Northwest, and the Texas Panhandle, who had previously begged the Montana factory for more inventory, suddenly began canceling their standing orders. Massive, white, 14-foot-tall tractors sat unsold on dealership lots. They baked in the Kansas heat. They froze in the Dakota winters. They gathered dust in the California valleys. They slowly accumulated crippling interest debt for the local distributors who could not afford to keep them in inventory. The sprawling new production facility in Havre, Montana, built just years earlier to handle what seemed like infinite demand, suddenly became a massive financial liability. The production lines quieted. The master welders were sent home. The vast inventory of thick steel plates, Clark planetary axles, and heavy-duty twin-disc transmissions transformed from valuable production assets into crushing overhead costs. As the farm economy fractured, the second structural force accelerated the collapse: competition from consolidation and corporate farming. The major domestic manufacturers, John Deere, International Harvester, and Steiger, faced the exact same economic nightmare, but they possessed a structural advantage that Northern manufacturing fundamentally lacked. They possessed immense corporate capital. John Deere survived the 1980s by absorbing massive financial losses, leaning on their vast international consumer base and heavily subsidizing their own equipment loans. International Harvester, bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars, eventually sold its agricultural division to Tenneco, merging with J.I. Case in 1985 to combine their dealer networks and weather the crisis under the Case 1H banner. Steiger, the prominent Fargo-based builder of green articulated tractors, was eventually absorbed by Case as well. The agricultural equipment industry was rapidly consolidating into a few heavily capitalized conglomerates. These surviving corporate giants weaponized their capital against independent manufacturers. A farmer looking at a new, mass-produced Case 1H, or John Deere, articulated tractor might be offered factory-subsidized financing at low single-digit interest rates. Northern Manufacturing, operating as an independent custom builder, had no corporate financing arm to subsidize loans. They could not offer 0% interest. They could not rely on selling consumer lawnmowers or small utility tractors to keep the factory lights on. They built high-margin Titans, and the American market for Titans had effectively disappeared. But the farm crisis and corporate consolidation were only the initial blows. The true vulnerability of the Big Bud philosophy, their brilliant reliance on independent third-party heavy industry components, was about to be exposed by the very supply chains that made their tractors possible in the first place. The market had taken their customers. The supply chain was about to take their parts. The great irony of the Northern Manufacturing Company was that the very strategy that made their tractors invincible in the field, their reliance on independent third-party industrial components, eventually became the mechanism of their destruction. This was the crushing reality of parts, service, and labor costs in a contracting agricultural economy. When Northern Manufacturing built a Big Bud, they did not cast their own engines or forge their own gears. They purchased Detroit diesel or Cummins engines, twin-disc transmissions, and Clark planetary axles. During the booming 1970s, when the commercial mining, logging, and heavy construction industries were thriving, these parts were relatively affordable and abundantly available. But as the American economy entered a severe recession in the early 1980s, the heavy industrial sector collapsed alongside agriculture. The third-party suppliers faced their own severe financial crises. To survive, companies like Twin Disc and Clark were forced to drastically consolidate their manufacturing lines. They discontinued low-volume, specialized components. When they did agree to manufacture the massive, heavy-duty parts required for a Big Bud tractor, they raised the prices exponentially to cover their own overhead. Almost overnight, the cost of manufacturing a custom tractor in Havre, Montana, skyrocketed. At the exact moment when American farmers had absolutely no capital to spend, Northern Manufacturing was forced to raise their prices just to cover the surging costs of their supply chain. But the most devastating supply chain failure did not involve steel. It involved rubber. To convert raw, 900 horsepower output into actual drawbar pull, the Big Bud 747 relied on 8 custom-manufactured 8-foot-tall tires. These were not standard agricultural treads. They were highly specialized custom-molded tires built exclusively by the United Farm Tire Company. In the late 1980s, buckling under the weight of the broader agricultural depression, United Farm Tire filed for bankruptcy. The company was liquidated. The molds used to cast the 8-foot tires were lost or destroyed. For the Big Bud 747, this corporate bankruptcy was a fatal blow. The massive machine had already proven its mechanical immortality across the American continent. After its time deep ripping the hardpan of California for the Rossi brothers, the tractor had been sold to Willowbrook Farms in Indialantic, Florida, where it spent years dragging heavy plows through thick, abrasive swamp mud. Eventually, it was purchased by the Williams brothers, who brought the Titan back home to Chouteau County, Montana. There, it pulled an 80-foot cultivator across the rolling dryland wheat fields, finishing hundreds of acres a day. The iron frame was unbreakable. The Detroit diesel engine was meticulously maintained. The heavy-duty transmission shifted flawlessly, but as the 1990s approached, the original custom tires began to rot, crack, and lose their integrity. Because United Farm Tire no longer existed, there was no company on earth producing a replacement tire that could bear the 100,000-pound weight of the 747. The most powerful agricultural machine ever constructed was effectively grounded by a discontinued rubber mold. While the 747 sat paralyzed in a Montana shed, a final, insurmountable force swept through the American tractor market: technological disruption. By the early 1990s, the philosophy of agricultural engineering was fundamentally shifting. Corporate giants like John Deere and the newly formed Case Wingate and Aldesiani Case to AH were abandoning raw, mechanical brute force in favor of digital efficiency. They introduced tractors equipped with microprocessors, electronic fuel injection, and radar-based ground speed sensors. These new machines optimized fuel consumption, electronically managed wheel slip, and paved the way for precision, GPS-guided agriculture. The American farmer of the 1990s no longer wanted a massive, simplistic mechanical beast that they could fix with a wrench. They wanted fuel efficiency, data collection, and digital diagnostics. The Big Bud philosophy, uncomplicated, open architecture, heavy iron sovereignty, was suddenly viewed not as an advantage, but as an outdated relic of the 1970s. The Havre factory, bleeding capital and suffocated by debt, could not afford the tens of millions of dollars in research and development required to transition into the digital age. They had survived several ownership changes and desperate restructuring attempts, but they could not out-engineer the microprocessor. In 1992, the production of the massive white tractors officially ceased. The Northern Manufacturing Company, which had once built the absolute kings of the American dirt, filed for its final bankruptcy. The Havre factory locked its gates. The assembly floor went dark. The master welders left. The parts bins emptied. The dealer signs came down. The supply chain broke. The market moved on. The massive 747 was backed into a shed. The engine was silenced. The giant slept. The fields went quiet. After the Havre factory closed its doors in 1992, the Big Bud name entered a long, quiet period of commercial silence. The rights to the brand and its blueprints passed through various hands, including a brief, unsuccessful period owned by the Meissner brothers. But the dream of mass-producing the massive white tractors in an independent facility seemed definitively dead. The American agricultural market had rapidly moved on to digital integration, precision GPS hardware, and corporate consolidation. For over 2 decades, the name was largely relegated to history, yet the underlying philosophy of raw, independent horsepower refused to die. In 2023, the Big Bud name was officially and spectacularly resurrected. Ron Harmon, the visionary behind the original 747, partnered with the heavy equipment manufacturer Rome to introduce a brand new Big Bud tractor to the American market. It was built on the exact same principles that defined the iconic 1970s models: a massive Caterpillar engine, standardized heavy industry components, a thick steel frame, and absolutely no restrictive proprietary software. It was a direct, unapologetic response to a modern agricultural market that had grown exhausted and frustrated by digital locks. But the true enduring legacy of the brand lies in the surviving original machines, meticulously maintained by a fiercely loyal American preservation community. Across the Great Plains, from the Dakotas down through the Texas Panhandle, a vibrant secondary market of custom fabricators, local diesel mechanics, and dedicated collectors keeps the original Series 3 tractors alive. These are not merely polished parade pieces or museum artifacts, they are highly sought-after, premium-priced working machines. A fully restored vintage Big Bud will frequently command hundreds of thousands of dollars at an estate auction. And at the absolute center of this enthusiast community is the legendary 747 itself. For years, the 100,000-pound Titan sat effectively paralyzed as a museum piece. Because of its rotting, irreplaceable custom rubber, it spent several years on static, silent display at the Heartland Museum in Clarion, Iowa. It seemed destined to serve as a permanent, motionless monument to a bygone era of agricultural excess. Then, in 2020, the Williams brothers of Chouteau County, Montana, the tractor's final working owners, decided that the 747 was simply not finished. They partnered with Titan International, a major American tire and wheel manufacturer, to construct entirely new, massive custom steel rims. They fitted the Titan with 8 massive, modern low sidewall, or LSW, tires, effectively solving the supply chain bottleneck that had grounded the machine for a decade. The immense effort to resurrect the 747 and the enduring premium value of original Big Bud tractors across the American Midwest is not driven merely by historical nostalgia. It is driven by the harsh, frustrating reality of modern American agriculture. Today, a farmer purchasing a brand new $500,000 flagship tractor from a corporate giant like John Deere or Case Wine H is buying a machine governed by millions of lines of proprietary code. If a single electronic emission sensor fails in the middle of a critical Iowa corn harvest, the tractor's central computer will often lock the engine into a limp mode or shut down the transmission entirely. The farmer cannot legally bypass the software. They must stop the harvest, wait for a licensed corporate technician to arrive in a service truck, and pay exorbitant diagnostic fees while the weather window rapidly closes. A Big Bud represents the ultimate heavy iron rejection of this digital system. It possesses no microprocessors. It has no emission sensors programmed to throttle the engine. A farmer armed with a standard wrench, a heavy-duty hydraulic jack, and a basic understanding of diesel mechanics can rebuild a transmission right there in the dirt, bypassing the dealership entirely. It is the massive physical embodiment of the American right to repair movement. Today, the physical agricultural landscape of Havre, Montana, still bears the distinct marks of this fiercely independent empire. The original northern manufacturing factory buildings still stand proudly along the windswept railroad tracks, now operated by Big Equipment Company. The concrete assembly floors that once birthed the 747 are still covered in thick steel plates, massive transmission casings, and heavy-duty axles, as local mechanics continue to rebuild original Big Buds for a completely new generation of farmers. But the most surprising footnote to the Big Bud story is not found inside a restored factory, but out in the dirt. When the Williams brothers finally installed the new Titan wheels on the 747 in the fall of 2020, they did not transport the restored machine back to the museum in Iowa. They drove the 100,000-pound machine straight out to a massive dryland wheat field in Montana, hitched it to an 80-foot-wide chisel plow, pushed the throttle forward, and went back to work. After more than a decade of total paralysis, the largest farm tractor ever built by human hands was actively turning American soil once again. The story of the Big Bud 747 reveals a profound and lingering contradiction at the heart of American commercial culture. It highlights the vast, unforgiving gap between what an industry actively demands and what a corporate supply chain will actually allow to survive. The independent engineers in Montana proved beyond any doubt that it was physically possible to build an indestructible machine, a tractor that could effortlessly shatter the hardest California clay, pull significantly wider implements than anyone thought mechanically possible, and easily outlast the men who welded its frame. But absolute mechanical perfection is simply not enough to survive in a heavily consolidated, debt-driven economy. The Big Bud Empire was not destroyed by inferior engineering or a lack of farmer demand. It was destroyed by 20% interest rates, a brutal farm credit crisis, and a bankrupt third-party tire manufacturer. It stands as a stark reminder that in modern agriculture, a farmer is never just buying a machine. They are inextricably buying the fragile, complex, and deeply flawed corporate supply chain attached to it. Yet out on the rolling, sun-baked plains of Chouteau County, where the harsh wind cuts across endless acres of wheat, the white colossus remains unbroken. The 16-cylinder Detroit diesel engine still roars with an unapologetic, industrial thunder, its massive new tires violently gripping the earth, the 80-foot steel implement trailing silently behind it, as the Big Bud 747 continues to tear deep into the Montana soil. See you in the next one.